You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Belfast Telegraph columnist Alison Morris and the Chief Executive of the charity Business in the Community, Mary McLeod. They'll both be with us from now right up until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Times reports on the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's major fiscal policy speech, in which he emphasised what he feels is the need to prioritise tax cuts for businesses over those for individuals. The Express also leads on that speech and says Mr Hunt's policies will help get millions of people back to work. While the Mail says ministers are looking at ways of reforming pensions to encourage people over the age of 50 to get back into the workplace. The Mirror says the world's 5 biggest oil companies are poised to announce profits of £160 billion. The Financial Times has news of an admission from HM Revenue and Customs that it gave incorrect information last summer when it said no government ministers were under investigation. Of course, it turned out Nadeem Zahawi was, though he denies any wrongdoing. The Guardian leads with an investigation into foreign governments, famous names and billionaire business figures buying large amounts of land and property in the UK using offshore arrangements. And the Eye carries the result of a survey which suggests that while many people are unhappy with what they regard as the effects of Brexit, there was no clear majority on the question of rejoining the EU. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Alison Morris and Mary McLeod. Welcome to both of you. Good evening. Let's start with the Express and this story. The Chancellor really dangling perks under people's noses to get them back to work, to get the over 50s back to work. He says that your country needs you. Alison.
Well, I don't know any over 50s who are not working at this point in stage. I'd love to know who these over 50s are who are all relaxing and kicking back at home at this point in time. And it also says he's going to, announce tax perks for people over 50 to encourage pensioners and the long-term sick to get back into the workforce. I'm not sure that this is the answer to kickstart the economy, because the problem is with jobs at the other end. So, in lots of industries, such as teaching, I have friends who were in teaching years before they could get a full-time job because retired teachers were continually coming back in and taking up those jobs, or they were refusing to retire at a certain age and they were staying in and sort of job blocking almost those jobs. You imagine to get the economy running too, we need to open up jobs at the other end. And also, if you look at the industries that are having problems in terms of construction, all of those things that slowed down during the lockdown, you're not going to get too many 65-year-olds, carrying hoods on building sites. They're young people's jobs and jobs that need to be created for young people. So, while I think it's good to encourage people who can work to go out to work, I'm assuming that if you're over 50 and you're not working, you've some sort of pension that I'm certainly not in tune of, because I think I'd still be sitting here, hopefully not speaking to ourselves when I'm 70, trying to make a living because my pension is so poor. But the real problem with the economy is getting young people and those people who are desperate, graduates and people who are at the other end of that scale, back out to work, rather than trying to encourage people who have already retired back into the workforce.
Mary, do you think Alison's right in that perhaps the Chancellor is looking to tap an incorrect source for a new workforce?
Well, I always get nervous when you talk about older people in their 50s.
Don't we all? Don't we all?
And like Alison, I'll probably be working until I'm 70. But I think there's definitely something about the 50s age group. If you look at doctors, their pension needs to be sorted so that we can keep doctors working as long as possible. And that is something that structurally needs to change within their pensions. I think there's definitely people being encouraged back into work, and that may be things about dealing with, of course, skills and also menopause and other things that the workplace needs to take account of. But in the end, I think it's it's the point about this, which sectors, it's whether it's schools, whether it's hospitals, hospitality, care homes, it's across all sectors that there's challenge on skills and talents. So I guess what Jeremy Hunt was doing was setting out a vision, his vision for long-term prosperity in the UK, trying to get us about, I think, 3 million back into work. And it's also about sort of productivity. So there is a huge economic potential around the UK, but it's going to take some time. And I think it's great to hear the optimism, and they should definitely sort of try it. But it's not just the one thing that will solve everything.
Yes, we read that 6.6 million are economically inactive. The Chancellor saying we will look at the conditions necessary to make work worth your while. Alison, do you think that there are any conditions that will get people back? I mean, you're saying it might not be that many of the over 50s, but get people back into the workforce who've chosen not to work at this point in time?
Yeah, I read the headline and it said to encourage pensioners back to work, and then it said tax breaks for over 50s, and I'm like, I'm over 50, I'm not a pensioner. In my head I'm like 25, so why am I being lumped in with pensioners in this plan? But yeah, I mean, I do think that some people may have retired and then regretted retiring and just feel really bored and want to go back out to work, and they have skills obviously that they'll be of use. But I mean, that's not going to be a great deal of people, and anybody else who's over that age and managed to retire, I'm assuming, is financially well off enough that they don't need to work. And the job creations and to try and get the economy boosting, as Marie said, there's just so many sectors that are lacking in staff, and obviously all the staff that was lost specifically to hospitality because of Brexit and the fact that immigration rules changed, all of that. It's trying to look at how then you fill those holes. And we noticed that we all seen that during the COVID pandemic, the shortage of nurses and doctors and those sort of really skilled staff, and the only way you can do that is investing in universities and making sure that they're coming through and being trained. But it's a nice idea if he thinks it's going to get, but I'm not sure how many people it's going to encourage back out to work again.
We shall see. Let's move to the Times, and then they're concentrating on the Chancellor's part of the speech addressing tax cuts, in which he's saying that tax cuts for businesses will be prioritised over those for workers, and that's his solution, or at least that's the way that he's going to order tax cuts. It will be businesses first. Mary.
Yes, and I think that is definitely part of the solution. So he's wanting to try and first control inflation, reduce inflation, and then reduce taxation on businesses. And I remember lobbying government for getting rid of business rates, and he was mentioning that because I do think it's an unfair tax. Employers' national insurance as well, he talked about. So there are definitely things that they can do, but employers are having to be much more flexible now and really look at the needs of staffing and employees, because they're given the war for talent. It's so important that they focus on what is right so that they can do to retain that talent. And that includes, doing a huge amount for supporting employees through this really difficult time, because this is a cost of living crisis that we're in. And so people want to see delivery on these things by government, but businesses are also trying to do something. We've just launched a cost of living task force with businesses to say, look, there are things that you can do to support your employees, your customers, your suppliers, and also local communities. And so whether that is sort of paying the living wage, allowing flexible working, targeting special additional support where needed for some staff, customers, making sure that they're, providing affordable products and services, paying promptly suppliers, and promoting volunteering in communities. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and businesses can respond some way to that. And we saw it certainly during the pandemic with the National Business Response Network, where, an example of that, 500,000 people were supported. And if you take an example, Tesco Mobile gave 1,800 telephones to 34 charities that they could all stay connected. So businesses are trying to do something to actually support anything else that's happening that government might be doing.
And Alison, how do you think the public will view that decision to give the tax cuts to business over that for individuals?
I suppose really important in terms of I'm dealing, obviously I live in Northern Ireland and we don't have those huge big industries in the way other regions would. It's really, we're a nation of small businesses and they really do need that sort of rate relief, maybe looking at corporation tax and all sorts of other issues to try and keep them afloat because most were really struggling and it's the price of fuel and everything else that has increased their costs. I mean, I work in the newspaper industry and the cost of printing a newspaper is almost doubled. I mean, all of those things that the cost of that has to be felt somewhere. So I think that that could be really welcome, especially for those small to medium-sized businesses who are really struggling because they don't have that sort of huge backlog, of money sitting aside. They're struggling and making ends do from sort of month to month. And so, yeah, I think that that would be welcomed if it's able to trickle down quite quickly and target those businesses that need it most.
Meanwhile, we read in the Mirror that oil giants are preparing to announce profits of £160 billion. And this, as we know, as families struggle with their energy bills, Mary.
Yes, and these headlines aren't good because people see the struggles that they have personally with the cost of living and what seems to be sort of huge profits. And that's why, we've continued working with businesses to support as many people as possible. And I think this is, I also think the power and the real influence can come from bringing together the business community, government and civil society in our local communities, because that reality of life as it is at the moment for so many who are living on the breadline, who are going into debt, who don't know where their next meal is coming from. It's an incredibly worrying time. And that's where, we'll help businesses with creating those action plans to support all their employees but government has to do their piece too, to make sure they're working with the oil companies and energy companies to give the best deal possible to customers.
But Alison, people will be asking that some of these profits should be ploughed back into the customers to help them with their bills.
It really is. It's quite obscene when you look at the scale of the profits that they've made at a time when the cost of energy, especially just before Christmas, it was soaring to the point, where we had, pensioners who were sitting in shopping centres or in coffee shops all day long just to try and keep warm because they couldn't afford to turn their heating on at home. I know working, mothers who were not turning their heating on while their children were at school and trying to save the heat for when the children got home. And then you look at things like this, and also businesses who've had their lights put out by this because they just couldn't afford to pay the gas bills because their bills were tripling and in some cases quadrupling. And then you see these huge profits that these companies are making. And I do think that there is an onus on government to make sure that these companies are not preying off people's misery. I mean, obviously, everyone is out to make a profit. That's the whole point of being in business. But when you're making such obscene amounts of money when people are struggling, you can see why many people would be angered looking at that front page tomorrow morning.
So what do you believe the government should be doing?
In terms of that, I do think that they should be putting a cap on the amount of profits and that those companies are allowed to put on, the amount of profit that they're allowed to put on that energy. I mean, there should have been capped, and I know that there was talk before Christmas that there would be capped energy prices, and that I think should be as a matter of legislation. I don't think that they should be allowed to just pull a figure out of their head, and that's what they were charged. And we were told this was a global problem because of the war in Ukraine, but clearly it wasn't a problem that was affecting those companies. They were still making their profit, whereas we were having to pay at the other end of it. So if it was an issue with the war in Ukraine and a shortage of supply, well, then you imagine their profit should have been down, but instead they're not, they're soaring.
Mary, let's move to the Financial Times, and Nadeem Zahawi still making the front pages, but this time it's the UK Tax Authority that have admitted that they gave misleading information last summer when they said that no government ministers were being investigated, even though Nadeem Zahawi was. Mary.
Yes, it's a very strange story because you expect HMRC to know the detail of what they're doing, and so it's frustrating for all of those people who are finishing tax returns this weekend. It's frustrating if the HMRC don't get things right, and it shouldn't be difficult for them to simply work out if there's any ministers or politicians who are being investigated for this. But hopefully this story will end eventually, when, of course, the investigation is going on. It was given 10 days, so it's hopefully a quick, as ethics advisor looks into it, Sir Laurie Magnus. So hopefully we'll get a solution to it. And of course, Nadeem Zahawi denies any wrongdoing, and he says it was a careless, not a deliberate tax error. But it needs swift action, and hopefully we'll get it resolved. Because we do need to rebuild trust in politics, in democracy, in our politicians, and these headlines don't help, because many do feel it is broken and have lost trust, and I just feel it's really important that we do, and because we do need that trust in the political system and in democracy, so that we can have a really strong society. And so these stories don't help.
Alison, do you think this apology now from HM Revenue and Customs that they made a mistake, does this change the story in any way as you see it?
Well, I did sort of raise a smile when I seen that the excuse they give was that it was a mistake in answering a freedom of information request, because as a journalist, and anyone who's ever dealt with that sort of FOI process, you've almost got to know the answer to the question before you ask it. But I mean, the amount of excuses I've got from government departments over the years in terms of FOI requests, so it's ironic that that's what they're falling back on as the excuse for this, and it doesn't do Zahawi any good, because it's drip feeding this information. It would actually have been better for him had this all come out in one go. But the fact now that we have this story drip feeding in various amounts means it lasts longer, it stays in the headlines longer, and Marie's right, for public confidence and confidence in the government. Public confidence is an all-time low after the complete, shambles of leadership elections last year and everything else that went on within the Conservative Party. They really need to try and get that public confidence back, and so issues like this need to be resolved. And also, the Prime Minister needs to show that he's able to control his party and to take action against issues like this swiftly, and make sure they are resolved, and resolved very publicly. I do think that there's nothing to be done from hiding aspects of this from the public. You know what they say. It's trying to sort of cover it up or drip feed things out. That's what always ends up getting people in the end. You're better just being open and honest and putting the information out there and letting the public see for themselves.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview, still with me, Alison Morris and Mary McLeod. Let's have a look at the Telegraph, and this is obviously gone to print before we've had the update. They're saying at least 5 Israelis shot dead and several others wounded. This is in the attack on the synagogue. It's now 7. Sadly, that number has been revised upwards. Take us into this story, Alison.
Yeah, I mean, it's really concerning that they have this upsurge again of violence in the Middle East. And we know that this comes periodically. There was an Israeli attack on the West Bank. They're saying it was the most deadly in decades, where I believe they're saying there was 9 people killed, and now this terrible attack on a synagogue as well in Jerusalem this evening. And as news comes through, those numbers are going up. At this point in time, I think it's 7 plus the attacker himself, who have been shot dead. But I mean, the escalation of tensions in that region is always really destabilizing anyway. But the fact that this has been going on, I mean, from as long as I can remember, we have these upsurges of violence in this region. And the fact that the response, I think, has always been from the global society, has not been good enough. When you look at how, America and Britain were able to step in and help Ukraine, and yet we have this situation, with the Palestinian people in the West Bank and the terrible conditions that people are living in Gaza, and then also the sort of the counter attacks that are happening in Israel. I mean, this is something that I don't think that there has been enough global attention put towards trying to resolve this long term for the people in that region. I've visited that area myself many, several years ago, and such a beautiful part of the world, but just so troubled. And so being someone that comes from a very troubled part of the world myself, but is now in post-conflict, I really feel for the people who are living in that region and these continual cycles of violence that are affecting, elderly, children, people from all walks of life.
Yes, and our correspondent out there in Jerusalem reporting tonight, Alistair Bunkle, had spoken to people who are warning that this could be the start of another intifada, Mary.
Yes, and it's it is really sad, and I'm similar in that I've always remembered this from such a long time ago. Just continued violence and disturbance in the Middle East, and it just seems so sad that there's no resolution to it. at any time. And I think it's, though many have tried, but it's just, there's people who are ready to die to defend their land, and then lives will be lost. And I think it's especially sad today also, of course, with National Holocaust Memorial Day, where, I remember taking some local school children in West London to see Auschwitz, and, it was just absolutely, traumatic and rightly that we sort of commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, given that, 6 million Jews were killed at that time. And yes, so it's really important that we still remember that and try and find a solution to the issues in the Middle East.